Now, where did I put it? Here it is.
Welcome to the Toolbox, where my guests and I discuss the tools they use every day to manage life, trauma, and everything in between. It may not be applicable right now, but it's another tool for your toolbox. And I hope you enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome back to Tools for the Toolbox. I am Chance Burles. As you know, I have another outstanding episode and guest for y'all. If you couldn't figure it out, I am with my brother Seb Lavoie here. We are in his house and we are here to record. Thanks for being on again, brother.
Hey man, thanks for having me.
So today we're going to talk about some pretty cool stuff. We were discussing this earlier and we're just going to jump right into it before we even go anywhere. We were talking about the pipeline, the development systems, how we train people to get into the jobs that we are, that our background comes from. Where do you think that starts? Is it the training program? Is it the recruitment process? Is it the actual selection? Is it like, where do you think that process begins to get really solid people into good positions?
Yeah. And it's always the splitting of that fine balance between having really solid people and having heartbeats in position, right? Yeah. And so that's what's really difficult. But I think historically, one of the issues that we've had, and I'm speaking organizationally, both with the CAF and the RCMP, for example, is there is a misconception that in order to get people interested and to get people in, they cannot be challenged. They need to be coerced essentially into it, right? Or convinced to be in. And that is evidently not the right strategy to begin with. So if you look, and we had this conversation earlier about the Marine Corps and how it has one of the lowest recruiting budget, yet it has the highest numbers of applicant. But if you look at every single U.S. Marine Corps historical documentary or anything, they've always had the same attitude with respect to, are you good enough to come here? Are you good enough to cut the mustard? Are you good enough to be successful? And it's interesting how it kind of works the other way around. If you don't do that and you're trying to baby people through your processes, they tend to shy away from it. You know, humans like to be challenged. Yeah. And so I would say, with respect to your question specifically, it's a combination of all of those factors. It's a multi-dimensional, multi-layered approach to problem solving these. So yes, recruiting is one part. Then selection for specialty units is another part. And then, you know, character trait and character-based leadership, and, you know, the list goes on and on and on. How do you make it the best place to be at? And how do you make it appealing? It's anybody's guess.
Well, that's what I'm here to figure out. That's the whole point of this.
We're going to solve this, by the way.
We're going to solve the problem right here today. It's on. We're calling our shot. It's out there.
Mic drop, walk away. The CAF's problems and the RCMP problems all fixed.
We have fixed it all. Yeah. There was an old saying within the Army, I don't know if you guys got it, was if you want to fix any problem, talk to a corporal. They'll give you a fix.
And there's a saying in the policing world that says there's two things that cops hate: change and the way things are.
It's 100% true. It's tough to get anything moving in those organizations. But okay, so let's dive into this a little bit more. If we have,
yeah, man.
One of the issues that I saw coming through the pipeline was the buy-in from instructors. So in my basic training, we had Navy and Air Force and Army all teaching all trades, right? It made sense. You have all people coming in, all people teaching. Cool. You get to SQ, you have Army personnel teaching Army stuff. Then you get to your actual threes course and you have specific trade course people teaching trade course stuff. Again, it makes sense. When you get to the next realm, like when I did PLQ, the leadership course, we were getting taught as an army-wide thing. So it was like general leadership. But the infantry have their own PLQ, their special PLQ, right? And from what I understand, the difference is the fact that we don't carry mortars and infantry do. And
Okay.
That's apparently a side. But because we then went back into an all-arms position, we had instructors from all arms teaching basic leadership stuff so you had a infantry guy or an artillery guy or an armored dude teaching, again, infantry or armored or clerks, or we got like mixed into any army unit in there. And unfortunately, the level of leadership training or the level of skill sets that the instructors had at the time was not, I don't know, up to my standards, I guess, at the time. I was looking at it like, I think I know more than you people, and that was an ego issue of my own.
That's for another conversation.
I've already worked that one out. That's fine in and of itself. But the thing that I noticed throughout all of my time in, and even when I was teaching, was the fact that it's tough to get instructors to buy in, at least from what I've seen, into that the fact that you're developing the way in which people think, right? So what I saw was people teaching and being good teachers, and here's the tools and here's the information and this is what you need to do in this situation, blah, 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 blah. But I did see a lot of other instructors who were just, they were filling a space, right? They were there because they needed a break from the unit or they needed whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think we develop the instructor corps to develop that next iteration of people? Sorry, just because the other thing that I want to mention in this is that we never really send our best guys to the school. You know what I mean? So how do we get into that?
Yeah, we've had very similar problems organizationally with the RCMP over the course of, I would say, decades, where recruiting was one of those areas or one of those sort of mission set that nobody wanted a part of. Nobody that was operationally relevant and capable.
Yeah.
But what the historical propensity has been is to send less desirable people to those positions, which is the worst thing you want to do in terms of gatekeeping any sort of entry to your organization, right? And we know that, and we know it doesn't work that way. So imagine if you're having problematic people and all of a sudden those problematic people are now in charge of choosing who the next people are. Well, that's kind of like Kublai Khan deciding to get the Chinese that he just conquered to build a boat so that he can go invade Japan. And one typhoon wiped out the entire fleet. Shocking. I'm sure the Chinese put all their hearts and mind into building those boats, but it's kind of the same as, to make a correlation. Recruiting is one of those areas that's critically important, and having top-notch gatekeepers and having people that have buy-in into what it is that they're doing and understand how it affects the bigger picture. And so whose job is this to inform those guys and get buy-in from them? That's leadership's job. And again, we're talking about leadership being the root of all evil, but also being the fix to most problems, right? And so for me, if I'm in charge of a unit that has, say, 5 or 6 instructors that need to be brought on board so that we may maximize or optimize our recruiting or optimize our efficiency or whatever the case may be, I'm going to make sure that I have the team on board and that they understand the broader impact of their work and how serious it has to be taken. And once you've established that kind of culture, it's really hard for somebody to be a dissident in that because everybody else is kind of on board. So one of the things that I hear all the time when I teach leadership courses is, well, there's always that person that you won't be able to change. And you're absolutely correct. There's always that one person whose logic defies reality, and you'll never be able to impact them to the point where they jump on whatever it is that you are doing. But tell you what, if you make it very unpopular and if you make it the norm, to be, striving for excellence, and you get most of your people on board, it's gonna make it very uncomfortable for people that are not that, and also not a safe haven for them. I'm gonna go to recruiting because I can kind of cruise for the next 2-3 years off the unit and, do whatever. No, that's actually, they take it really seriously over there. And if I'm going there, I'm going to have to pull out. I'm going to have to put out, and I'm going to have to put out in the way and in the manner that's maximizes our success, basically. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. That I think, again, you and I were talking earlier, but leadership is the key, right? It's the key that unlocks all the negativity that comes with occupational stress injuries and post-traumatic stress, and it's also the key that can mitigate that ahead of time. And we were discussing earlier the fact that you need to start looking upstream, right? We all recognize that there's a problem. We all recognize that mental health and mental awareness and making sure you look after your people and all these, like, we're looking at the lessons learned over the last 20, 30 years going, okay, we could have done better for sure. But now we were talking earlier that we have to look upstream and start looking at, like, how do we solve this for the next generation so that they don't have to deal with this shit. What are you working on right now? Because you're telling us that you're doing leadership training, the critical incident?
Leadership through critical circumstances.
There you go.
Yeah.
Talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah. So I guess I can sort of speak to how this came about. So I was a team leader on a full-time tactical team, SWAT. And we've had a few let down where some of our people were involved in fatal shootings, and some of which we have lost forever, just in the way they were treated after. And again, as we were discussing earlier, the majority of occupational stress injuries come by way of sanctuary trauma, which is essentially, this should be your safe space. You're prepared to do whatever it is in the course of your duties. However, what you weren't prepared for is the way you were treated after, by leadership, by way of process, by way of whatever in the organization. And so what ended up happening is we lost a few guys on operations, just from mental and emotional strain, and some of which will likely never recover. And I hate to say that, but that's the reality. I mean, they are affected to the point of it'll be very difficult to overturn, even though they're trying everything they can. So when I became a team leader, I had two guys that were involved in a hostage rescue where they basically killed a bad guy who himself had already killed someone and all this stuff. And we are now running onto almost 2 years of investigation from the Independent Investigation Office, IIO, here in British Columbia. And what I ended up doing is essentially going to the IIO and saying, look, I reversed onus on them. Is basically, look, I have two guys, their entire family. This is a straightforward call. This guy had already killed someone. This guy was obviously ready to ambush the police. The guys entered, did what they had to do. He was presented with a weapon. He was stopped. And let's not make it sound like there was anything Machiavellic here or there's any indication of any wrongdoing, because there isn't. It was self-righteous. It was a righteous, not self-righteous. It was a righteous shoot, rather, based on the totality of the circumstances. And right now you're holding, those two people hostage. So I realized that there was a lack of clarity on who was doing what. And when there's no clarity on who's doing what, guess who's doing anything? Nobody, because everybody assumes that the next person is going to do this. And if somebody does something, what is the tracking history, and what is the continuity, and what is the, how do we make sure that balls are not dropped once roles are changed and the person is moved somewhere else, and who's supporting the process after they're gone and all this stuff. So we had none of that. So I started looking into what police department had a really good, solid post-shooting protocol, which was specifically for shooting at the time, but evolved as this went along. And Chicago, shocking, had a dialed in process, and Chicago has an entire psychological unit that's dedicated to essentially reinsertion, recovery, prevention, like all those things. So they have an entire unit that pushes out content and courses and whatever to help Chicago police officers deal with critical incidents. So I got in touch with them. I got a copy of their documents, and I got permission to use it to develop mine. So I wasn't going to reinvent the wheels, but there's a lot of things that were very different organizationally for us and that needed to be amended. So I used it as a framework. So I had a, general bearing of where I was going, but changed a ton. But in there, I also had a bit of a research project going on at the same time where I was interviewing the people that were involved in critical incidents over the course of the last 5, 6, 7, even 10 years, and establish what it is exactly that either triggered an occupational stress response or things that they knew could have been done better. And the things that were done right are quite self-evident, but the things that weren't done very well were not so evident, right? And so what I came to after 2 years almost of interviewing and having these conversations, what I started to realize is that we are putting so much emphasis in being reactive when it comes to wellness, when the reality is it needs to be preemptively loaded, but also needs to be supported at all ranks. And also, it seems as though there was always one person that dropped the ball. And you know what? What's interesting is the person that dropped the ball didn't necessarily drop the ball willfully. They didn't necessarily because they didn't care or anything like that. But a lot of the times they were following, say black and white process. And the process wasn't individually tailored to suit the person that they were dealing with. Therefore, it was perceived by that person as being the wrong approach to problem solving, whatever they had. So what I came up with is evidently there is no process and there is also no consistency in how things are addressed. So I designed this. I realized that instead of focusing on having, wellness programs and PTSD, clinics and all this stuff, which is all reactive stuff, and it's all great stuff, but it's all a bit late in the game. How are we to mitigate this? And the best way to mitigate occupational stress injury and wellness issues is leadership. Is through leadership. The more leadership understands how to recover, the pillars of the recovery process, how those pillars can be implemented in your daily operations at work, during your training, or even on operation. And how this will impact your people, and understand that everybody along the way, along the chain of command, including the constables in the case of policing and the privates in the case of, the CAF, have a role to play in ensuring wellness and supporting wellness. And so this is how this leadership through critical circumstances course came about. And then I started involving other things that have the potential to affect, because I think one of the key pieces of information that's often missed as well is that generally a critical incident is compounded by administrative stress, home pressures, those types of things, right? So those are not critical by themselves, but when compounded, they can become that. So one of the things that I started doing is hey, what if a person is going through a divorce, for example? And for anybody who's been through one, I've heard guys say, I would go back into combat before I get divorced again. I've heard guys say that. So it tells you, it's an indicator of how serious and how very egregious divorce and separation can be, and how stressful it can be, and what kind of impact it can have. So for example, in my leadership through critical circumstances, we're talking about divorce, and we're talking about how, as a leader, do you sort of sympathize and understand the mechanics of dealing with a divorce so that you may have the empathy necessary and have enough workable knowledge so that you can actually help in the process, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of how this course developed, and it's all about There's no deflection in there. We're not looking at everybody else to come in and take care of our wellness. It's all about how do we display leadership at all ranks so that we can fix the problem from the inside out.
Yeah. I mean, the best way to deal with any problem is at the source, right? And the source right now is the inside, where we have to get to. We got to get those people to buy into it and really develop it. I remember there's a very simplified version of it, but we were doing a leadership, rehearsal thing for I think it was the early portions of the PLQ. And one of the things was like, your trooper comes in and he smells bad. Everyone's like, yeah, okay, great. We got to deal with the guy who's got bad BO, whatever, right? But that's a symptom of a larger issue, right? And the fact that he's not showering is something else. And the fact that he's not presenting himself well is another issue. And instead of what we got taught was, you got to take this guy aside, you got to talk to him and be like, hey, dude, you need to fucking shower, right? But the real key is not just that he needs to be mandated to shower. It's that he needs to be taught why he needs to be clean, because, there's all sorts of other issues that that'll propagate in the future.
Sure.
So really, I guess the question is then, how do we get someone to walk through the door? Because, again, you and I were talking earlier, I always say this, is that if I'm going to help someone, I can show them the door. Cool. Here's all the information you need to do. You need to fix yourself with this information. How do we get others to grasp that information, actually utilize it?
You mean in the context of getting people through the door of the organization, or through the selection process, or through
any of it, really? I mean, when you're talking about mental health, even from a critical incident, how do we get somebody to go, okay, you know what, that incident, it did affect me. How do I then utilize those tools? You're talking about people that want to go to selection, but I mean, what was it we were talking about last time, where people would tell you like, oh yeah, I'm going to apply for the team next year, right? Or I'm going to apply for the team. How do we get them to go, no. You need to be right with it ahead of time and then go do it. So each stage of the way, it's kind of the same thing of just getting someone to accept the reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I think if we had the answer to this today, we'd probably solve the majority, at the very least, of some of the soft units problems, right? And it's really hard. It's really hard to do that. So the question becomes, how do we make this place as appealing as it can be? And the best way to do that is to have a professional organization. Like the best way to do that is to have a truly professional organization. So I'll give you an example, like the RCMP right now, and which is really interesting because for people that are in the know, there's levels to the RCMP's games. And depending which province you're in, there are major differences in terms of budget, capabilities, those types of things. And there's good people everywhere, don't get me wrong. But if you have the infrastructure and the operational demands to actually support what you are asking for and what you're doing, and you actually can turn around and say, we didn't have this and this happened, you're ahead of the game. Whereas if you're somewhere where nothing ever happens, everything is theoretical, and you're now asking for things that might come down the line, but if there's nothing to correlate it to, if there's no reality to correlate it to, it's going to be a really hard sell, right? And so, anyways, I digress. But I think that focusing on making the organization, and I don't like to use the word glamorous, but if you look at the U.S. Marine Corps, for example, as an example of that, they make it, extremely appealing to be a Marines. They, the pride is in the roof, the historical, and it's founded a reality. I mean, they've been involved, in conflicts for 389 years or something stupid. Yeah, the Marine Corps was founded as like 1700 or some, I can't remember what it was, 1785 or some, and I can't remember for sure. So please don't quote me on this. Just Google it.
200 plus years.
Yeah. I mean, it has a long tracking history of that. And so for me, I'm less concerned about trying to convince people. How many good people need to get convinced to go to a certain line of work? How many architects are getting convinced to go to architecture? How many, youth workers are being convinced to go work with youth? The answer is none for the most part, and so the mission statement, the support, the optics surrounding the organization that the person is looking at is going, if presented favorably, is going to increase the numbers big time. What we think we need to do is lower standards and make it easier. And the fact is, you can make it as easy as you want. People still won't come. Because it's not just about that at all. In fact, people don't mind being challenged, and they don't mind it to be hard if there is actual appeal to what it is that they're going to get at the end of it, Yeah. So it's a fine line, man.
Yeah, it is. Because I like Satch was over at the house the other day, and he was talking about like people need to know about JTF2, and I was like, yeah, they need to know about it, but there's something mysterious
mystique
here, right? You're like, ooh, JTF, right? People don't know, everything's secret, no one knows, blah blah blah. So there's again levels to the game, right? There's you want a level of mystique, but you also want a level of attainability where people can like, oh, I can actually be a part of that.
Sure.
I think the SEALs do a pretty good job of this too, is that they just promote the fact that it's like an 80% attrition rate. And it's like, are you going to be one of those people? And, again, we were saying this earlier, is that the type of people that are in the SEALs are the type of people that are going to be like, fuck you, I'm good enough.
Precisely.
All right, let's do it.
And it's really interesting, because then it ties into sort of these units and organizationally, often specialty units anyways, will be force multipliers, right? And so as we are looking at putting bodies in seats, so say if you're looking at patrol, for example, where, what the organization wants is somebody with a heartbeat to take a file, that's not always a winning strategy, but sometimes running short with the right people is the way to go, and I hate to say that because evidently it burns the right people when we could have enough numbers, but also the right people and be good to go. If our sort of recruiting strategies were different and we made it what it can be, but
Well, do you think that there's a way to get people trained up to the mentality, if you know what I mean? So instead of, waiting for the right people to show up on your door and cool, great, now we have these great people, how do we take anybody and give them the skill sets to succeed in that thing without making, again, it's fine line, right? How do you keep that without taking away from it, right? It's
Well, it goes back to the 18 X-ray program in the SF over on the other side of the border, where in the States you can be a civilian and apply directly to the Special Forces pipeline. And I believe they have workup courses to prepare them, like land nav, those types of things to prepare them for selection. And then they go to selection, and if they're successful, they go on their Q course or whatever it is, and they go from there. And it's been a very popular and very successful program. They get former BMXers and freaking extreme athletes and water polo champions and captains and whatever the case may be. But what they've done is they've opened a pipeline that cuts essentially all the bullshit out of the process. If you are wanting to be a special forces operator, or if you're wanting to be a part of a special unit, and you have a skill set that's conducive to that, there is no reason why you shouldn't be able to get basic training requirements and send people to there. So one of the things that people don't like in policing, for example, is patrol.
Yeah.
right? A lot of people want nothing to do with patrol. And I was one of them because I knew I was wanting to go to ERT long before I even joined the force. However, for me, it was a point of pride to make sure that my patrol time was done with the utmost professionalism, but also that I build a name for myself. And in fact, it works the other way around. If people are coming and they just want to go to specialty units and they slough off the work along the way because all they can think about is where they're going next, they generally don't make it there because they don't build a reputation they need to have in order to be supported and an asset for those specialty units down the line. And so having an opportunity to actually really individualize where people are going is also a really, really good. So I'll give you an example of that. We've had some CANSOF guys transfer over and go straight to ERT. Does that make sense? Hell, it does. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Are there challenges with that? 100% there are. Because anybody who shows up on a police call, on a regular patrol call, that doesn't understand the basic flow of a patrol call is at a disadvantage. Mm-hmm. But can you bridge that gap by having them go to another province, do some patrol time, like at 3 months? For 3 months, you're going to be answering calls for service on a 911 with, a coach, a field coach, so to speak, so that you get the exposure that's required, so that when you show up on a patrol file later and there's an armed and barricaded, for example, that you understand the basic priorities and that you understand how the flow of the call would work according to general duty, so that you may bridge the gap and direct the investigation and the tactical response in the way that it should be. So I went on kind of two different tangents here, but basically give people an opportunity to maximize their chances of success in whatever field that they're interested in, and give them an opportunity to actually go there. Yeah. And then whatever it is that, skipping a certain part might cost, make sure that there is a way to bridge the gap.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I struggled with when I first got in the military was the fact that you have to spend 3 years in a line unit before you can apply for special forces. And what they always told us was the fact that you need to understand how to work as a team. You have to understand how the Army works and how the blah, 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 and all the procurement. But as we were mentioning earlier, was the fact that when you teach shooting, it's easier, or the people that have never shot before, who are then just taught the right way, will shoot better than those that haven't, or that have learned previous because they have bad habits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the same thing happens within the big Army, is that we, you join, you learn a bunch of habits that work within the big Army, and then you go to Special Forces selection and you try and use those skills there. But if you were to take someone off the street and teach them the basics, right, send them to basic training, be like, okay, here's how to march, here's how to freaking throw a high five, and cool, you're good to go. You can give someone the ability to exceed their own expectations within a framework, versus just like throwing them together. Because I mean, the problem is if you have a whole bunch of people who just come in off the street, then that's going to change the entire culture of the outfit, because they're just coming off the street. They don't have any historical background. They don't know how this works. They don't know how that works. So yeah, it's a fine lines, lots of fine lines there to actually manage. So if the issue then is, how do we could get the right people, we could get them through a pipeline that, teaches them the skill sets to be successful without giving up the issues. I mean, these are all things that we could implement, right? That's not like anything out of the framework of possibilities here. How do we then keep the culture effective? Because again, you're going to have influxes of people coming in, different ideas and different things that maybe not so much bad habits, but like you're going to have outside thinking coming in. How do we then keep our culture but still be open
Yeah. So culture and thought process and problem solving through diversity of thoughts are two different things, right?
Okay.
So what we're after is a culture of respect and wellness. That should be the framework and the parameters. Aside from that, the Mission X phase of this is flexible, and we have to have the ability to pivot. But we also have to realize is that having diversity of thoughts increases problem solving abilities exponentially. Mm-hmm. And so what some of these units have seen, like the 18 X-ray program in the States, I know has been extremely successful in bridging that gap. And what they have realized is that when people are actually joining directly into what they're after, they are very keen to learn. They're very receptive. They're very coachable. So all of those things sometimes will make somebody after 6 months of prep pipeline better for a specialty unit than the person that spent 3 years in the traditional army, shining boots and doing freaking pepper potting in the field for hours on end, right? Whereas, and so I think, and I, again, if we could solve all the world's problems, be all over it. But I think that really, really having opportunities presented like this and essentially cut a lot of the bullshit, and I use this word because we know in the CAF, in the RCMP, like there is a lot of bullshit. Mm-hmm. And can we cut through this, through red tape, organizational red tape, and actually make things happen, move and shake, Mm-hmm. And yes, it's hard to turn a freaking aircraft carrier around versus a speedboat. So you have a department with 5 people in it. It's easy to maneuver, right? You can kind of establish the culture you want and boom, Bob's your uncle. But for a larger organization, there needs to be a lot more work put in order to accomplish that. But I do believe that a lot of the times people are simply not interested in putting up with whatever it is that they need to do so that they may get what they want. Mm-hmm. And yes, we can call it the generation of instant gratification. We can call it whatever we want, but that's the reality we're faced with right now. Mm-hmm. And so, and then it brings the other question: have we done it right forever? And the answer is no, we have not. And also the definition of insanity being doing the same thing all over again, expecting a different outcome. If it isn't working, then you're not fixing it by doing the same thing we did 800 times. So I think, for the CAF and the RCMP and other organizations, having mental flexibility and having flexibility of actions, being able to operationalize innovative thinking is such a critical piece. And we're kind of stuck in boxes, and we operate in boxes, and we stay in boxes,
Well, it's easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to sit in your box. It's comfortable. It's I don't know how many times we were when this whole thing with Russia kicked off in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many of my buddies were just like, I have training for this because we've been doing Russian tank recognition for years, and you're doing. All of our training was based off of taking on the Russians, and this is the way it's going to be, and we're going to dig trenches, and we're going to have tank lines here. And I'm like, we have 12 tanks, in the whole freaking country. It's not like we're going to be going toe to toe with Russia. And I always thought it was silly to think you're training an entire generation of soldiers to go to Afghanistan using doctrine from the 80s, the 70s, at the height of the Cold War, right? Where it's like, oh my God, Russia's coming across Germany, and then we're going to have to do a whole conventional fucking war against them. And sure, tactics, training, great, sure, that can be part of it, but our doctrine was based on it. Mm-hmm. And, I remember coming out of off of patrol in Afghanistan we were out there for 4 or 5 days, something like that. And we came into CAF to refit. So we were just there for the day. My vehicle ramp dropped. I had 1 foot on the ramp, 1 foot on the dirt, and my sergeant major was in my face saying, "You need to fucking shave." And I was like, Roger that, sir. Like, yeah, cool. But that was his concern, right? And that just, it drove me nuts because institutionally, that was what was important.
Sure.
And I think culturally, that's what leadership in the prior had taught him, right?
Yeah.
So, we were talking about this earlier too, was that I don't like to say things are wrong because at the time when they were instituted, it made sense. But I think what you're saying is that flexibility is the key, right? Being able to look at something critically and say, is this actually important right now? Right? Because sure, if I'm on the parade square and I'm not properly shaved, that's an issue, right? That's a big issue because I'm not taking personal pride in what I'm doing, et cetera, et cetera. But when you come out of the field, that's not the time or the important thing. Like he should be. If they were my troops, I'd be like, "Hey boys, how you doing?" Right?
Precisely.
What do you need? What can I get you? You want some? You want to pop? You want to go for coffee? What do you want? Because for me, that was the first thing was porcelain, right? Be actual porcelain. I'm going to go use that, and then coffee. Those were the two things I wanted most out of anything. I definitely did not want to have to be told to go shave right away. And sure, I could have. You could have told me later. You could have sat me down, or like as everybody got off, and be like, "Hey, boys, shitters are over there. There's hot water. Blah blah blah. If you need to shave, like you can do it in a way that's not directive." You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. I mean, I think the way I like to look at this, and this is a conversation I had with actually the Corps Sergeant Major in the RCMP as we were negotiating some of the issues that you've seen in the media, such as the Blue Line debacle and a variety of different things, or the perceived issues with the Blue Line. We as a warrant group, for example, like in this case with your SM or whoever it was, we have leadership chips, and where we use those is critically important to credibility of the warrant program, but also establishes your character as a leader. And so for you to be unable to separate garrison stupidness implemented for, reasons that are, unknown to anyone nowadays, and having certain things enforced that are not necessary, but not prioritizing wellness, not prioritizing operational capacity. And don't get me wrong, I mean, anything that impacts operational readiness is a big, big problem. So yes, you want to have those dialed in. But if you undercut your own leadership by addressing something that's completely asinine, that's irrelevant, and it's empirical stifling, so it's coming from years and years and decades, and you have no idea where it's coming from. You're just repeating stuff and regurgitating them, and you're using your leadership clout as a vehicle to do that. Good luck. Because once you've lost all credibility, it's going to be almost impossible to recover from that. And if you ever have to take that leadership in a field of operations or in a theater operation, good luck. Right? So it's not to say that it'll be impossible to overcome, but how do you want to be perceived as a leader? And I'm not saying you have to be liked by everybody, because not all decisions you're going to make as a leader are going to be popular. That is an absolute fact. But if you've established your character as being a character of somebody that's behind the troops, that's supporting the troops, that has wellness and prioritize, the right sort of leadership priorities, then when you make a tough call, people are like, look, wait a minute here. I know Chance, and historically he's made nothing but great calls. I guarantee you that if he's made a certain call, he had reasons to do that. And before we hear what those reasons were, let's kind of take a breath here, kind of thing. So establishing your character as a leader through those small things, the things that you say, but the things that you don't say are also critically important.
Yeah, your reputation is it needs to be known, right? And that's the challenge is when you first start being put into a leadership position, a lot of times you really don't know what you're doing, right? And so you're trying to emulate what you've seen in the past, or you're calling on things that you haven't trained before, right? So I made many mistakes in my first foray into leadership. I fell back on rank. I've fallen back on volume, right? All the things that you're not supposed to fall back on. But at the time, those were the tools I had. I didn't actually, I didn't know any other tools to utilize at the time. Through those iterations, though, I saw like, oh, if I just yell at them, they don't want to deal with me, right? If all I do is start throwing around the fact that I'll be like, private, do this, they're going to be less likely to get the work done ahead of time. Mm-hmm. But when I was proactive and I wanted to do things for the troops, I got really good feedback from them. Like I built some benches in my unit bay. At one point, I had a warrant come in and take out. We had a bunch of rolly chairs in our bay. They took them out because they were a safety hazard. And then we had some desks in there. They took them out too. So we had just basically an empty bay that we sat in all day on the concrete. Like, what are we doing here? I think I lasted about 2 days where I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. So I went to the scrap wood bin. I started pulling a bunch of stuff out, and I started building these benches surreptitiously that the warrant didn't know. And,
wow.
Well, no, he came down once and he was like, what are you doing? I'm like, construction training. And he was like, roger that, keep it up. And I was like, good. And then one day I had everything cut and pre-ready, and then he came down for a quick inspection, and then they left, and me and like 3 or 4 guys just assembled them really quickly, and we threw them in the bay, and we painted them all our colors and put our logos on it and stuff. And when the warrant came down that afternoon, he was like, he couldn't really do anything about it because it was already done. Mm-hmm. And they have all our logos on it, and they're not a safety issue because they're static and blah, 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 blah. But the another example was we were sitting around doing nothing. So I took everyone to a different area away from everyone else. And I was like, what do you guys want to know about? Right? Like course progression, possible. I had just come out of the intelligence cell as well. So I was like, do you guys want intelligence briefings? Do you guys want to know what's going on in the world? What do you guys want to know? So we sat there for 45 minutes and just brainstormed different ideas. And then I left for the weekend, and I came back having researched all this stuff, and I just handed it to them. Okay, boys, this is what this is. And this, we spent all day talking about it, and I got really great feedback from them saying how informative that was, and they wish we did this more often, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a line in Band of Brothers. I think it was Dick Winters was talking to Bill Compton as there's construction being done above us. God. And they were saying, don't ever put yourself in a position to take from your men. And I think that's such a great lesson just in general. If you put yourself in a position to take from others, you're not giving, right? You're not teaching, you're not developing, you're physically taking from somebody. And yeah, I thought that was just always a really great little foundation for leadership. Mm-hmm. Start there. Don't take from your men. Mm-hmm. Do you have any little pearls of wisdom in terms of leadership like that, where you just like little one-liners that you could share with the world?
How about care? It starts right there. You know, it's really interesting. The historical way that we've led both in the CAF and the RCMP, historically was a very autocratic style leadership. And that was at times required based on the fact that you had people there doing extremely dangerous things that didn't and weren't trained for that for an extended period of time. So during World War I and World War II, for example, with conscription, right? For example, so if you have 19-year-old conscript, I mean, and we're talking volume, we're, large masses and numbers. It's really difficult to develop, the buy-in and all these other things. So it's not impossible, but it is difficult. And to a certain extent, a little bit of autocratic leadership in those instances might have been preferable at the time. But when you have a volunteer force, it's a completely different ballgame. When you have a volunteer force, they join for a reason. Make that place, focus on making that place what it needs to be, and watch them thrive and wanting to make it better. And if they don't, let's make it super unpopular for them to not be that way by encouraging and enabling everybody else that is that way, which goes back to the exact point I was making earlier. There's always going to be that one person, but you do not punish the masses on account of one person. You address that one person. You problem solve that one set of issues with, individually, on an individual basis, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's funny because you always want to just like fix the problem, right? We were talking about this with guns earlier, was the fact that like, okay, guns are bad. Okay, get rid of all the guns. So there's like 400 million guns down in the States, something like that. There's 2 million some odd gun owners here in Canada. Yeah, there's lots of construction going on right now.
Yeah, I hope that this
I'll
is.
try to edit this out.
Yeah.
But it's not a feasible thing to just say, okay, fix it, no more guns. Right? That's not a feasible answer, and yet that's the one that's kind of being fed to us by politicians. It's like, just get rid of guns. We'll make it illegal to have guns, and it'll be like, well, then just only bad people will have guns.
Yeah. But here's the interesting, and just not to interrupt your flow here, but here's the interesting with this. The interesting thing with this is that the people that re-elected the certain person that's leading this initiative were essentially elected him on grounds of that.
Yeah.
So there is an actual divide between Canadians when it comes to firearms, the intended purposes, and what it's going to do to illegalize them or prohibit them. And there is some clear misunderstanding there. There's no question that that's the case. And there's some rainbow and unicorn sunshine thinking, on one end. And so for me, who's responsible for this now? We as Canadian have elected this dude in a position that, in my humble opinion, he shouldn't have had a lock on ever to begin with. But what we are forgetting is that it's not just government led; it's supported by a vast portion of Canadians. It's not just, and so the propensity for human beings is to always deflect. It's always, regardless what kind of bad decision you've made, whatever predicament you find yourself into is always somebody else's responsibility. It's always somebody else's wrongdoing. It's always somebody else's that didn't see the light or didn't enable you or didn't, whatever the case may be. And so we need to start taking responsibility here individually. We elected somebody that makes these kinds of calls, and we are continuing to support him by re-electing him again and again. We wear that, as a society.
So then how do we get people that we like and espouse and think that should be there? How do we get them into politics? Because this is like, nothing's going to change unless someone is on the inside to change it, right? And that's, as we said, change comes from the inside. So, I don't like politics. I don't want to be involved in politics, but I also recognize that I can't change shit unless I'm actually involved in there. So how do we get people like you, or perhaps even say Sean or Tim or any number of other veterans or advocates or people who are looking at, who are in leadership roles within the community? How do we get them into physical leadership roles?
I have no idea. I have no clue.
That's the hard question.
And also with that comes another question, which is, if you had the right person in the wrong system, can they actually impact the outcome, right? Whereas if you had the right group in the right or in the wrong environment, could you make a substantial difference? And the answer is yes. The problem that we have is we don't really work together that well at all. And as soon as we unite, things are changing very quickly. So an example of that would be back in the 90s, there was a crazy war in Quebec between the Rock Machine and the Hells Angels. When I say a crazy war, I mean they arrested people with Carl Gustav willing to shoot through a club lineup to kill 2 people. You know what I mean? Like it was a serious, and ultimately the culminating point was a vehicle-borne IED that blew up an 8-year-old. And that's where before that, there was no uniting force in Quebec. And essentially people just went about their business and didn't really care at all. It was like, you know what? It doesn't affect me. If it doesn't affect me or my direct sphere of influence, I don't give a shit. Yeah. Until the boy died, and now they started seeing their own kids and their own mortality, and their, you know, and it happened in a little sleepy hollow where you wouldn't expect that or whatever. It took a matter of minutes, figuratively speaking, to change the laws where bikers were no longer allowed to wear colors, to hang out with more than 2, to do this, to do that. So it made their life miserable, and it made doing business pre-smartphones and all the amenities now. It rendered very difficult to conduct illegal activities, essentially. What stopped the population of Quebec from doing that 4 years before? Well, everybody was being dumped on every street corner. Yeah. You know, nothing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's apathy, unfortunately, when you have people who are more willing to just go with it than fix it. And as you said, until people, I tell everyone this, that everyone hits a rock bottom point where they're like, it's untenable. We need to change this. Something needs to change. If it's your mental health, sometimes it's, you know, sitting there staring at the pistol, reading the serial number over and over and over and over again. Sometimes it's, you know, getting an injury and realizing that you were never mentally there to begin with, and you need to sort that out. Sometimes it's financial, right? Everyone hits a rock bottom where they go, I need to change something. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, you know, bad things happen. And they happen pretty regularly, actually.
To good people.
To good people, yeah. And for no reason.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with my mom at one point in time. We were talking about firearms control and stuff. And I was like, at the end of the day, this is the issue. Anybody can create violence at any time for any reason. And you just might so happen to be the person that violence is aimed at. So wouldn't you want to be as best prepared for that eventuality as you possibly could? Mm-hmm. And she was like, well, no, I think I'm happy with the way she was, is what she basically said. And I realized that's, you know, certain people are just happy with the way they are, and they will continue to I had this talk with Dave Grossman about, you know, the illusion of safety is that we all just believe that we're safe, and therefore we are, for the most part, up until you're not. Mm-hmm. And you need to be prepared for that eventuality, I guess.
Well, it comes back to being a gardener in the war and a warrior in the garden, right?
Yeah.
With that, I always add the little piece of, if you stay in the garden too long, you become a gardener. So
yeah.
So you need to be on the skills required to remain in that sort of living that warrior ethos, right?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to what you're comfortable with, right? Mm-hmm. Like I'm not great with a pistol. Mm-hmm. If I was carrying on a regular basis, I would be much better. Mm-hmm. But I don't carry on an everyday basis. I pull my pistol out every once in a while, and I do some draws and I do some dry fire, and I go to the range every once in a while. Cool, right? It's for more for my entertainment than anything. Mm-hmm. But my rifle work is still very good because I continually train it. I keep working it. Even though I can't go to the range with it anymore, I still work it because I don't ever want to let go of those skills just because. Right. And
it was lost in a boating accident, was it not?
there's some issue with moving, and then it was supposed to be there, then it wasn't, and I don't know. It just kind of
always seems to happen. It's happened a lot lately.
Lately, yeah, it's been interesting. Well, brother, we've been rolling for about an hour here, and I first off, I can't thank you enough for coming to get me and hanging out with me and chatting and paying for breakfast and everything. It's been outstanding, and I'm looking forward to the seminar we're going to do, or the panel we're going to do next. If anybody isn't already doing so or doesn't know you, how do they find you? Where do they do that? Give me a list of links and we'll...
Sure. So I suppose the best way to reach me is through my Instagram as Slav Cobra Commander. So it's basically SLAVCCMDR. SLAVCCMDR, Slav Cobra Commander. No, I know, right? and that's probably I spent at least 5 times more time than I should on Instagram every day. And my personal account seems to be very busy, and I generally will have most of my interactions on there. Now, with that, I also have probably around, 50 to 60 podcasts out. So all you have to do is to type my name, Seb Lavoie, Lavoie, and then you'll have you can take your pick, so to speak, because I have so many in various fields. And
you're doing Instagram lives now, like interview podcasts. Tell me a little bit about that before we.
Yeah, so I've started a few months ago, just having some conversations. I think my first one was Sean Taylor. Sean Taylor and I were having a conversation, and we thought, you know what, we should have recorded this. It would have been great content for our people so that we can put back in a collective. And so we decided to go live and do it. I did it with Mark Roy, one of the world's best black and gray artists, realism artist, tattoo artist. And it was great. And then I did, Tim Turner. I did Sukchata. I did, God.
It's tough remembering all the
anyways,
names, right?
My brain is fried right now because I woke up at 3 a.m. and I just been kind of a little bit fried. But I mean, so bringing these people from all walks of life and having various experiences, various backgrounds, various realities in terms of like diversity and whatever the case may be, it's been very interesting. The response has been very positive. And what I try to do is to bring meaningful conversations to the forefront and whatever I feel is meaningful. Obviously, I had people on about, the war in Ukraine and their volunteer work overseas, Delta Police, constable, like just amazing people to come and have conversations. And I just love to have conversations, and I just love for us to problem solve through conversations, through bilateral conversations, not just monologue, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I really enjoy it. I've watched not all of them, but a good chunk of them, and yeah, just really great conversations from all different ranges. The best part is that the conceptual way in which we're trying to pass on information over the last couple of years has been really awesome in general, right? It's just the fact that we're all kind of talking about the same thing, but we all come at it from different angles, and we're exploring the chaos that is the world in a much more meaningful way, I think, over the last little while. And
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're having a lot of the conversations that historically have been either taboo or subjected to judgment or whatever the case may be. And I think now there's an acceptability, and it all works hand in hand. And as you start poking holes into your own reality, you start being able to reframe it, but you start being able to produce a more meaningful, more purposeful life But in order to do that, you need to be very critical of what you are doing and how you are doing it. So in my job as a performance coach, those are some of the things that we are looking at. How dead set are you in your ways? And what is either sort of the propensity that you have to either self-sabotage or to remain comfortable in positions that do not maximize growth, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Because, what are you willing to sacrifice? Is what it really, everything, whatever you want, you have to be able to give up something in order to get it.
Sure.
So if you're not willing to give up Pop-Tarts, you're going to have an issue with your nutritional plan. That's
or you add burpees. There has to be
yeah. Well, you got to give and take, right? Yeah. If you want those.
It's inversely proportionate. As your Pop-Tart level goes up, or directly proportionate, actually, I should say.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of burpees in your future if you like those Pop-Tarts.
And inversely, if you start cutting the Pop-Tarts, you have less burpees to do, which is great.
Exactly. Anyway, brother, I can't thank you enough. This has been. Before we go, actually, I have one more question for you.
Sure.
Since you've begun the process, the podcasting and going live and doing the teaching and all this other stuff outside of the RCMP structure, what's the biggest thing you've learned? Or maybe the most profound or something? What is the key that you've pulled from it all?
Yeah, I think for me, I had a bit of I have a bit of a contradiction going on in that when I was in the RCMP, I have recognition bias, right? And teaching, when you have a recognition bias, is very easy. So if you're teaching a group that already know you as a solid leader, as a person they can trust, as a person they can relate to, as a person that's approachable, all these other things, as you are coming into an environment, they already are open to learning. They're already open to the concepts that you'll introduce. The challenge has been to go in other departments and other organizations and non-police related organizations, and to have the ability to bridge the gap between my operational experience and how this impacts or has the ability to impact their line of work, their business in a meaningful way without me having to impose competence, because imposing competence just doesn't work. I can show up to a group and tell them all about why I'm the greatest leader ever. It's still not going to work, right? So I have to essentially, I don't even try that. I never would anyways. But all I have to do is to trust that the material itself is substantial enough and credible enough and founded on research and reality and data that's substantiatable, so to speak, and then that they can relate to, and then I can relay the information. That is a big challenge. It's very different to teach when you show up and you already have an established name.
Yeah.
Very easy. And so that's been sort of the biggest challenge I found, like even going to some of the muni departments. And sometimes, I have lots of muni friends, but sometimes munis, man, they can have toxic cultures big time as well. And you show up there as an RCMP member and they have their backup because, what does the RCMP know about leadership? Well, there's a lot of good leaders in the RCMP, believe it or not. Yep. Like despite some of the more negatively media attracting endeavors, there's a lot of good leaders that are doing work day in and day out that you never hear about, And so having the ability to sort of bridge that gap and perform well and have them maximize their learning without recognition bias, probably one of my biggest challenges.
That's a great. I would not have expected that one, but that is an excellent point, because that is very challenging. Stepping into a new environment without the background. Must dive into the imposter syndrome a little bit. I'm trying to.
Sure, it does. And so what do we know about the imposter syndrome? We know that most people that suffer from it are solid. Because generally people that are overconfident are not as good as they think they are, don't even tend to have that. But a lot of people will have that, and I'm no different. Sometimes it's like, well, what am I even qualified to teach them that? And they're all older than me. They have more service. They have more ranks. Whatever the case may be. And so how do you deal with that? Like, imposter syndrome is actually an emotional response to a stimulus. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with any emotional responses? With logic. Mm-hmm. That's all there is to it. I have the operational background. I have the relevant experience. I've conducted more research than any of those people. I've done, and so, and it's not about making yourself better than them, but it's realizing what you bring to the table so that you may overcome that imposter syndrome that's automatically almost triggered. Yeah. If you're a high achiever that, perhaps is faced with a set of circumstances that they believe might be hard to surmount, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been dealing with it for many years, and just recently that little issue popped up on social media with me, and I realized very quickly that whatever doubt I have in myself, when shit hit the fan, I had an entire crew of people that were just, they had my back without question, without thought. It was just, bang, this guy's solid. We got his back. And I think that's really like, look at your circle. Mm-hmm. That'll tell you who you're with. And if you're surrounded by solid, solid people that want to make a difference, then you're in the right circle, right?
Couldn't agree more.
That's the way to be. Yep. All right, brother. Thank you very much. We'll talk with you later.
Sounds good, bro.
Chimo.
That concludes another episode of The Toolbox. I really appreciate y'all listening. It has been my absolute pleasure bringing you this guest. If you enjoyed what you heard, please like, share, subscribe, do all that other wicked stuff. It helps me keep the lights on. To all those out there putting it on the line every day, I just want to let you know that I appreciate you. Military, veterans, first responders, civil servants, you name it. Keep this place running, and I really do appreciate it. So thank you. Don't forget, stay open, stay humble, stay focused, with grace, not slack. Chimo.